Alright, so I got an update here for you guys on Joe Biden somehow going even further in doubling down on cucking himself to the brutal dictator of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, as he is continuing with his offensive war in Yemen that has resulted in absolutely catastrophic consequences for the average people living there. So this is how basically this entire thing unfolded. A couple of days ago, we had this report that came out from Ryan Grimm and his buddy Daniel Boguslaw, who basically came out and told us that Bernie Sanders was doing his little version of forcing the vote and was going to bring a war powers resolution to the Senate to be voted on to essentially end U.S. support for the Saudi-led operation in Yemen. And so this was a great move. Obviously, a couple of years ago, there was a measure that was actually successfully passed that was attempting to rein in the war in Yemen, and our support for that, of course, that was vetoed by then President Donald Trump, and essentially they were making another attempt to end this conflict after years and years and years. And so this looked like it was going to be an absolutely great move, and then we got this today. Okay, so here from Bernard Sanders himself, he says, "Today I withdrew from consideration by the U.S. Senate my war powers resolution after the Biden administration agreed to continue working with my office on ending the war in Yemen," whatever that means. I mean, we're going to get into a breakdown here again from Ryan Grimm and Ken Klippenstein, but I mean, whatever this means, I have absolutely no idea whatsoever, because there hasn't really been, unless it's happening behind closed doors and we don't know about it, any real progress in terms of actually bringing an end to this war. So, whatever that means. But he says, "Let me be clear. If we do not reach agreement, I will, along with my colleagues, bring this resolution back to a vote in the near future and do everything possible to end this horrific conflict." Okay, well, another thing, that's going to be a little bit more difficult because if you were going to do this now during the lame duck session, that would be a little bit easier with more Democrats presumably in the House that would support this. Obviously, you have Republicans who just won the House and they are soon going to be taking office, so you have a limited window of time here where this is even potentially something that could be feasibly done. But now I want to get into this great breakdown here from Ryan Grimm and Ken, where they basically get into the backstory of how this all unfolded and what types of arguments the Joe Biden administration were using behind the scenes and openly in order to push against this very reasonable proposition here. And this is important for a number of different reasons, not just for actually ending the war in Yemen, but also just like on a principled stance, making it so that the president, the executive branch, can't just participate in wars like this without any congressional approval. Right? I mean, you're supposed to get congressional approval for these types of operations. We are essentially propping up the entirety of the Saudi Air Force, which is what's waging this campaign in Yemen. And so you're supposed to get congressional approval and, thereby approval from the American people through our representatives in order to actually wage wars like this. And of course, they haven't. And so basically the goal of this is not only to end the war in Yemen, but also to send a message more broadly that presidents can't just wage these openly unconstitutional wars. Okay, so here from Ken and Ryan, they say Bernie Sanders pulls Yemen war powers resolution amid opposition from the White House. So a little bit of details here. They say the White House and Senator Bernard Sanders clashed Tuesday in the run-up to a Senate vote on the war powers resolution put forward by the Vermont Independent, banning U.S. support for Saudi-led offensive operations in its war on Yemen. By the evening, Sanders had agreed to withdraw his resolution, saying on the Senate floor that he would enter negotiations with the White House on compromise language. Again, what does that compromise language actually mean? I have no idea, but he says, "I'm not going to ask for a vote tonight." He concluded, "I look forward to working with the administration who is opposed to this resolution and see if we can come up with something that is strong and effective. If we do not, I will be back." So I don't know why Bernie Sanders would assume for even a single solitary second that the Biden administration is interested in pushing for this type of a war powers resolution. Obviously he has been completely cucking himself to Saudi Arabia through and through during the entirety of his administration, but especially over the last couple of months. Of course, he went and did that trip over to meet Mohammed bin Salman. They did the fist bump and whatever, and essentially he got on his hands and knees and begged him to release more oil into the global markets. Mohammed bin Salman turned around, gave him a double middle finger straight to his face, and decided not only was he not going to be releasing more oil into the global markets to tamp down prices here in the United States, but he was actually going to slash the output that Saudi Arabia and OPEC were putting out into the markets and actually worsening the situation here in regards to gas prices and energy prices, etc. And so not only did he do that and did that whole trip and embarrassed himself and didn't even get what he was looking for out of the trip, but then on top of that, I also just covered on this channel a couple weeks ago, he's decided to give immunity to Mohammed bin Salman, somebody who he said he was going to make a pariah on the 2020 campaign trail. He gave immunity to this guy for having Jamal Khashoggi, a Washington Post journalist, killed and then dismembered. Okay, no accountability whatsoever. So not only are you not turning him into a pariah, you are essentially giving him full support to do whatever the fuck he wants and just emboldening him with his brutality. So, I mean, the Biden administration has been absolutely pathetic when it comes to our relationship with Saudi Arabia throughout the last couple of years. But now we have Bernie Sanders, who seems to think, I guess, that there's some indication behind the scenes that stance from the Biden administration is going to somehow dramatically change in the immediate future, and that he's going to push back against Saudi Arabia. I mean, it just doesn't really add up in my head in any way, shape, or form. But they continue. They say, if it had happened, the vote may have been close, as advocates believed they had 5 to 8 Republicans lined up to vote yes. But getting back, as Sanders said, will be a challenge as Democrats again lose control of the House of Representatives in early January, and a growing bloc of House Republicans have become resistant to U.S. military adventures overseas. Really, they're just talking about Ukraine for the most part, but current House Republican leadership has been opposed to curtailing U.S. support for the Saudi-led war in Yemen. And they say on Tuesday morning, the White House privately circulated talking points making the case against the resolution, saying President Joe Biden's aides would recommend a veto if it passed. So literally doing the exact same thing that the Trump administration did on this front. And of course, we know how cut Donald Trump as well is to Saudi Arabia, and, Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, getting a $2 billion payout from him, his connections with the Saudis on the Live Golf tournament, and the millions and millions of dollars that he's made from that, the, emoluments of violations during his presidency of Saudi lobbyists staying in his hotels and paying him thousands and thousands of dollars, the weapons deals, all of that. We know all of the corruption surrounding Donald Trump and Saudi Arabia, but now we have the Biden administration essentially just fully following in his footsteps on everything except, I guess, mild rhetorical pushback sometimes. But they say, so we read this paragraph, right? Okay, so they say they're strongly opposed to it and that they're going to veto it. And then they said, the White House argued in part that a veto in favor is unnecessary because a vote in favor is unnecessary because significant hostilities have not yet resumed in Yemen, despite a lapse in the ceasefire, and the vote would complicate diplomacy. So pushing to end the war would complicate diplomacy to end the war? How the fuck does that make any sense? And I mean, keep in mind, this is not just like an equal-sided conflict here. This is an offensive operation by the Saudis, okay? Using our support logistically, militarily, with intelligence support. Again, as Ro Khanna pointed out just a couple of weeks ago, we could essentially ground the Saudi Air Force tomorrow or next week if we wanted to, and we stopped giving them the weapons, we stopped giving them the, the parts for their planes and the, helping them with the repairs and all of that. We could end this war if we wanted to. So the idea that like, oh my God, it's this super complicated diplomatic thing that you just don't understand that we're doing behind the scenes, and voting to end our support for this war, that would just complicate the whole process. It's utter nonsense, okay? Complete and utter nonsense. But they continue here. We got a statement from the White House press secretary. They say, questioned by the White House press corps, Press Secretary Karine Jean-Pierre initially declined to comment on the administration's posture towards the resolution, but when confronted with the confirmation by Sanders, she acknowledged that the administration was pushing its preferred approach, saying, we're in touch with members of Congress on this. Thanks to our diplomacy, which remains ongoing and delicate, the violence over 9 months has effectively stopped, she said. And keep in mind, while there has been somewhat of a temporary ceasefire, which of course expired, thankfully it hasn't resumed into a an utter all-out brawl, which it could literally at any day because the ceasefire ended. But keep in mind, even as the direct hostilities maybe have been on pause, the Saudis are continuing to blockade huge portions of desperately needed supplies from getting into Yemen. Okay, there are still the prospects of hundreds of thousands of people, being faced with starvation and horrific conditions and displacement. Okay, millions and millions of people have been displaced as a result of this war. So, the disproportionate effect from the blockade and from the Saudis restricting the supplies into Yemen has actually killed way more people than the actual hostilities themselves. So the Biden administration coming out here and pretending as if everything has been somewhat fine over the last 9 months. It's completely and utterly ridiculous. But they got a pushback here. They say Jamal Ben-Omar, formerly UN Under Secretary General who served as special envoy for Yemen until 2015, was critical of the White House's claim that it was engaged in diplomacy, much less that the War Powers Resolution would imperil that. He says there's no diplomatic progress whatsoever. No diplomatic progress whatsoever. So what is she referencing up there? Who the fuck knows? They say there's been no political process, no negotiations, or even a prospect of them, so an all-out war can resume at any time. So again, it's a super tenuous situation, and they're pretending as if like, oh, we've made all of these great diplomatic strides and all of that, and we're, just on the verge of potentially working something out. Don't complicate this with the War Powers Resolution. They're just making this shit up, okay? They're just straight up lying to the American people, and in this case, also to Bernie Sanders. But they say the administration's opposition represents a reversal on the part of top Biden administration officials, including Jake Sullivan, Samantha Power, Susan Rice, Wendy Sherman, and Colin Cowell, who signed a letter in 2019 calling on Congress to override then-President Donald Trump's veto of the Yemen War Powers Resolution. Okay, so all these motherfuckers, back when Donald Trump was in power, they were saying, oh, this is terrible, we need to end this war, Congress should override his veto. Now they got a little bit of a change of tune here, right? They continue, warning that the legislation represented, quote, a constitutional matter facing Congress that may be unparalleled in its impact on millions of lives. The letter argued that the War Powers Resolution would go beyond just alleviating Yemeni suffering and address a core constitutional question of checks and balances that affects all Americans, saying the executive branch would be emboldened to launch and sustain unconstitutional wars without the legislation. Okay, let me say that again. This is the position of all of these people who are now working under the Biden administration. They said at the time that Donald Trump was president, the executive branch would be emboldened to launch and sustain unconstitutional wars. Okay, so they're admitting this, our participation in this war in Yemen, is unconstitutional. Why? Because Congress has not given them authority to do this. Okay, and this goes for so many other different covert operations and wars that we've been fighting overseas and drone wars that we've been fighting overseas. So many different things would apply to the same label. And I think that's partially why the Biden administration is terrified of this, not just because if this passed, it would piss off Mohammed bin Salman of Saudi Arabia, which honestly, who gives a fuck if it actually does? We shouldn't be allied with them, much less selling them weapons to continue in what has effectively been a genocide or an attempted genocide of the Yemeni people. But on top of that, again, it's this broader point about how the president, the executive branch, and this has been the case for decades now, effectively can just launch all of these different wars and military operations overseas without any actual approval or checks from Congress or the American people. I mean, this goes much deeper than just what's happening in Yemen right now, and that's why it's so important that this actually gets passed. And, obviously we would need somebody like Bernie Sanders on the front line aggressively pushing for that and aggressively pushing back against the Joe Biden administration. But it looks like for now he's just sort of like dropped his guns on the floor, and he's not willing to take this fight that publicly, I guess. So not exactly sure what his reasoning is here, but I'm sure we're going to get somewhat of an explanation soon. But they continue saying that Jean-Pierre's reasoning that a peace resolution would actually mean war. Let me say that again. Her reasoning is that a peace resolution would actually mean war. And that aligns with talking points distributed by the White House. I mean, really, a peace resolution is going to somehow lead to war. What the fuck are these people? I mean, do they really think that we're this stupid? Okay, that people can't figure this out? I mean, it's just, it's straight in your face ridiculous. But they continue, a coalition of anti-war groups and dueling counterpoints that were also circulated privately and obtained by The Intercept argued that the question of timing and delicacy did not mitigate or militate against the resolution. And they say a UN-brokered truce in Yemen expired more than 2 months ago. I think it was back in early October. The Saudis can resume airstrikes at any time. A previously announced end to the U.S. offensive support, that's the line that Joe Biden was using, if you guys remember that at the time, did not prevent devastating and indiscriminate Saudi airstrikes on Yemen, which occurred as late as March of 2022. Passing this legislation allows Congress to play a constructive role in the negotiation of an extension of a truce and a long-term peace plan. Okay, so counter to what the Biden administration is trying to claim here, this War Powers Resolution would not actually result in an extended war or a protracted war. In fact, it would do the exact opposite of that, unsurprisingly, right? Ending our support for an offensive Saudi operation in Yemen would actually reduce the likelihood of them continuing with the Saudi-led offensive operation in Yemen. I mean, it's like they try to pretend as if this is like super complex. It's really not that complex. And again, as Ro Khanna, pointed out, we could end the Saudi airstrikes that are happening just by stopping supporting them, right? I mean, it's U.S. weapons that are killing a lot of these people in Yemen, innocent men, women, and children frequently. I mean, that's our weapons. We are selling them these weapons, okay? Which, again, reminds me of this, debate about the whole Brittany Griner trade for Victor Bout and whatever. And it's like, where are the Republicans who are coming out and calling on the Biden administration, as they were calling on, the Biden administration to not make this deal to get this Russian arms dealer traded for Brittany Griner to get her freed from Russia after her bogus charges were brought against her and she got sentenced to 9 years? Where are all these Republicans who are freaking out about releasing a Russian arms trader because he's this evil guy and he's going around and selling weapons to nefarious actors? Where are they when we're literally discussing and debating whether or not to continue selling weapons to one of the most brutal dictators on the face of the planet, who is just indiscriminately committing war crimes? Okay, not a single peep from them. In fact, they will come out in opposition to these war powers resolutions whenever they get the chance to do so. And they're always on the front line, continuing for essentially the United States to be the equivalent of Victor Bout, but on a scale that's like times a billion, honestly. So, I mean, we are the greatest arms traders in the world by far, and it's not even close. And we have essentially no actual standards in terms of who we are willing to sell those arms to, whether it's openly through, our contracts with governments like Saudi Arabia, or covertly with, the CIA and other U.S. organizations smuggling guns to every nefarious actor on the face of the planet. But they continue saying Biden's own Yemen envoy, Tim Lenderking, that's an interesting name there, has warned that a failure to reach a new peace agreement would precipitate a return to war. While a UN brokered 6-month ceasefire was agreed to earlier this year, it ended on October 2nd, and on Monday, the UNICEF warned that 2.2 million Yemeni children are malnourished. 2.2 million children in Yemen are malnourished, with over 11,000 children having been killed or maimed in the war. So again, you see the scale there of something like the blockade and the catastrophic consequences that can have versus the actual fighting itself. I mean, the blockade is what we really have to be aggressively pushing to end, and then getting as many supplies and resources as they need into the country as quickly and efficiently as possible. But they say the war began in 2015, a little bit of backstory here, under Saudi Arabia's then defense minister, Mohammed bin Salman, now crown prince and prime minister, because remember a couple months ago he basically made that bullshit move to call himself prime minister to try to get immunity for the dismemberment of Jamal Khashoggi, and essentially the Biden administration fell for it completely. But now he's apparently the crown prince and the prime minister, and it's pitting the richest country in the region against the poorest, obviously being Yemen. And MBS, as he's known, told former CIA director John Brennan that the military operation, initially codenamed Operation Decisive Storm, would, quote, finish off the Houthis in a couple of months. According to Brennan's memoir, I looked at him with a rather blank stare and wondered to myself what he had been smoking. Okay, so clearly he has, the confidence of George W. Bush back in the early 2000s here, and it completely backfired in his face. And I mean, keep in mind, the main reason he doesn't want the Houthis in control of Yemen is because they are backed by Iran. They don't want an Iran partner that's to their southern border, for many different reasons, obviously, but doesn't remotely justify, continuing in this operation as they have. But they say the text of the resolution may be different than the one that was passed under the Trump administration, but the goal is the same, advocates of the resolution said. So here are the actual details in terms of what it would actually mean. They say this legislation reflects the latest developments in the conflict, and its directives have been adopted by the House of Representatives for 3 years in a row. Its operative text was endorsed in 2019 by Jake Sullivan, Ben Rhodes, Susan Rice, Samantha Power, Robert Malley, Wendy Sherman, and Colin Kahl. And while mid-air refueling ended as a result of previous votes on war powers resolution, offensive bombings in Yemen continued, even though Joe Biden said he was going to end offensive support for this ongoing war, which is stupid at face value because the entire war is offensive on the part of the Saudis. So that was just a pathetic excuse that he used there, a little rhetorical trick that I don't think anybody actually fought for or anybody actually believed in. But they continue saying that the offensive bombings in by Saudi Arabia and Yemen continued, including more than a year after the executive branch announced the end of the offensive support. And they say SJ Resolution 56 bans any U.S. logistical involvement of the offensive Saudi-led coalition strikes in Yemen, and such involvement is operationally essential for the bombings. It differs from previous legislation only in that it is tailored to end future operational U.S. involvement in Saudi offensive airstrikes, ensuring that they cannot resume without affirmative authorization from Congress. So again, I mean, that's why this is so important, is because it's a broader point about what types of offensive operations militarily that the executive branch can deploy unilaterally without any real underlying checks from Congress, who are supposed to have the ability to vote on whether or not we want to go get ourselves involved in wars overseas. Okay, so, it has massive implications here depending on whether or not they're able to get this passed. But according to the White House, unless I guess Bernie Sanders is going to be doing some wheeling and dealing, he is even willing to go as far as to veto this legislation if it was to pass. And so they make another argument down here that I thought was interesting. And I'll just finish off the video here because this is really just such an absurd argument that they were laying out here on top of all of those other ones that we just went through. But essentially, they're arguing this. So they say, finally, some administration allies made the argument that the resolution's definition of hostilities could set some type of precedent that could hamper support for Ukraine in its war against the Russian invasion, though the resolution is clear that it is limited to Yemen and only applies to offensive operations. So it seems like that just at face value wouldn't apply to the U.S. support in Ukraine, which I think there could be fair debate and questions about. And how much weapons are we giving them? What types of weapons are we giving them? Are we participating in actual legitimate diplomacy while we're continuing to support their defensive efforts? Have we been hampering their diplomatic efforts with our pushes behind the scenes? Are we just allowing the military industrial complex to get filthy rich off of this with no real end goal in sight other than escalating the conflict broader than what it already is right now? Auditing these weapons packages we've been giving them, whose hands are they actually ending up in? How much of them are ending up on the black market? Tons of different debates and questions around our support for Ukraine. Obviously, I think Putin is the aggressor there. He is the one to blame in terms of why that invasion happened in the first place. And obviously, I support the Ukrainians defending their territory and all of that, but there's definitely fair questions surrounding that. But this is the argument they're making in relation to this War Powers resolution. They say the whole thing is just embarrassing for Democrats, said Dan Caldwell, vice president for foreign policy in the conservative group Stand Together, backed by the Koch organization, and a senior advisor concerned for Veterans for America. And he says even though this started under Obama, they were able to claim moral high ground on the issue during the Trump administration. They just surrendered it again. The logical end of the Biden administration's argument is that you need to starve Yemeni children to support Ukraine. Okay, so again, there's your update, right? We have an embarrassing back down here from Bernie Sanders, and actually, I'll drop a note here because I just found out that Crystal and Kyle are actually going to be, I think, having a discussion with Bernie Sanders tonight. So we'll probably have a little bit more information for you guys on this tomorrow, depending on how that conversation goes and what his actual strategy is moving forward. But listen, this seems like it's a pretty weak move from Bernie here. You had to take this fight. You had to be aggressive about it. You had to openly call out the Biden administration for continuing to support these atrocities that Saudi Arabia and using our weapons and our support is responsible for against the Yemeni people. And you should have taken this fight. You should have been much more aggressive. And on top of that, this is just another indication of how completely cucked the Biden administration is to this brutal Saudi government under Mohammed bin Salman, who does not give a single solitary shit about Joe Biden or the American people or the American economy or anything like that. It's like you're making a deal with the devil, and the devil is stabbing you in the back and not even giving you your end of the deal, and then you're just continuing to get on your hands and knees and essentially suck them off into the future with absolutely no end in sight and absolutely no consequences whatsoever.
Everyone is saying GoodPoliticGuy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me. Everyone is saying